Divorce. It's rarely easy. And there are all kinds of reasons couples stay together long after the love is gone. Usually it's because they share something they just can't walk away from. Children. That's a common one. Money. That's another. But Sarah and Andy, the couple you'll get to know tonight, they stayed together because they shared something else. Secrets. Sarah and Andy shared so many dark and dirty secrets. Well, they had to stay together. Glued together for decades. Less husband and wife, and more like partners in crime. A life built on so many lies. The only thing that could rip them apart was the truth. And you will hear all about it in tonight's episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, the independent, ad-free true crime podcast made for nighttime listening. How can that be? A true crime podcast without a bunch of loud, obnoxious ads blasting you awake. Well, this is how it works. Dead Sleep is listener supported. So if you like the podcast, you can become a paid subscriber for around $5 a month. And along with the 2 or so episodes that come out for free each month, you can enjoy a bonus episode. You can subscribe via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. Now, tonight's episode is about 2 very famous people. People who are making headlines right now. Individuals formerly known as the Duke and Duchess of York. And tonight we're going to examine the story of the disgraced ex-royals from a point of view you may be less familiar with, but one worthy of greater scrutiny and understanding. But first, let's talk titles. On November 5th, 2025, Buckingham Palace released a statement from King Charles III removing all titles and honors from his brother, the former Prince Andrew, the ex-Duke of York, the one-time Royal Highness, who is now officially known as plain old Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. And by extension, Andrew's ex-wife, who was allowed to enjoy the courtesy title of Sarah, Duchess of York. She's no longer allowed to use that courtesy title. It is now back to her given name, Sarah Ferguson. Though if the prophecy of a British author and historian named Andrew Lowney proves true, the disgraced ex-Duke and Duchess will each be hit with a whole new title: criminal defendant. In the case of Andrew, this wouldn't be a surprise. His sick and sordid escapades with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell have been the subject of serious investigations and legal drama for over a decade. But what's lesser known is that this royal couple, whose own marriage only lasted 10 years, married in 1986, separated by 1992, and divorced in 1996. Well, they remained close, even after their marriage failed. Using that relationship and their connection, however tenuous, to the royal family, to enrich themselves in unprecedented ways. Of course, Prince Andrew, this was no huge surprise. Randy, Andy, Peter Pandy. He was raised to believe he was above the rules. But Sarah Ferguson, she was one of us. In her various biographies and interviews, Sarah depicts herself as a woman who loved too much, who gave too much, whose generosity was her Achilles heel. A woman who fell for the wrong man and had to fight to stay on her feet. She has described herself as a single mother of 2 girls who worked hard to put food on the table. In many ways, this is true. Fergie has had all kinds of careers. She's a master of reinvention. She's good at making money, but she's even better at spending money. Then at a certain point, Andrew and Fergie became so desperate for cash, they were willing to do just about anything, align themselves with just about anyone if the price was right. So as the ex-Prince Andrew's misdeeds are finally coming to light, so are suspicions around Sarah Ferguson, what she knew, what she did. Writer Andrew Lowney, he offers a few clues in his book that was published this past summer, entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York. And in this unauthorized biography, he dug deep into the financial records, court documents, along with hundreds of interviews. Andrew Lowney discovered that Sarah Ferguson, better known as Fergie, was for years fundamentally complicit in her husband's abhorrent behavior, choosing to befriend and shield sexual predators and solicit funds from some of the world's most unsavory characters for decades. There was no one exempt from this exploitation. And this arrangement of Fergie and Andrew living together for decades, which was framed as a friendship, turned out to be a framework for fraud. So again, how did this happen? How did a vivacious and good-natured young woman who drew people to her with warmth and kindness warp into a cold and calculating alleged co-conspirator with her ex-husband? For what it's worth, I had a whole other episode planned for this week, and then I got a chance to read Entitled, the book by Andrew Lowney, and I felt compelled to do this episode, especially if any of Sarah or Andrew's alleged transgressions end up in court. For years, most of us were aware that Andrew had a terrible reputation. But Fergie, most of us didn't have strong feelings because there wasn't much to know. If you're American, you remember Fergie from maybe some Weight Watchers ads from years ago. And maybe you, like me, actually felt sympathy for Sarah Ferguson. But maybe after this episode, we'll have a clearer, more accurate picture and the consequences of the very human instinct to believe one is special and deserving above all others. Now, this is the dead sleep bedtime version of events, and there is no graphic violence, just an exhausting saga of an ill-fated fairy tale. Drawn in part from Andrew Lowney's book entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, along with other key sources I will link to in the show notes. But before we get into the worst of times, we'll start with the best of times. Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew's wedding day, July 23rd, 1986. When 250,000 people in London, along with millions of people watching on television, held their breath as Sarah Ferguson emerged from a horse-drawn carriage outside of Westminster Abbey. There was great anticipation and, of course, concern. What would Fergie wear? They were expecting something quirky, unflattering, pink, maybe red. Fergie wasn't known for her fashion sense, but that day she wore a traditional wedding gown, slightly off-white, made from Duchess satin. But the greatest relief, for everyone watching, was Fergie had done it. She'd lost the weight. Sarah Ferguson's weight, always a topic of conversation in her family, was now fodder for public consumption. As she alighted from the carriage, standing patiently as her 17-foot-long train was arranged. One male news commentator noted approvingly, "Oh, she's thin." Sarah Ferguson's rise was something of a Cinderella story. Once described as plain and unrefined, she soon captured the heart of Prince Andrew, who loved her red hair, her cheeky sense of humor, and her fearlessness. Sarah was an adventurer, an avid downhill skier, an expert equestrian, so admired for her athleticism, Prince Charles once prodded his then-wife Princess Diana to be more like Fergie, which meant to be more fun, be more physical, be more outgoing. On her wedding day, Sarah was glowing on the outside, but inside, she was hollow. Really, there was nothing in her stomach, except maybe butterflies, because Sarah hadn't eaten much of anything these past few weeks, months. Determined to lose 26 pounds before her wedding day, Sarah did what she always did. She went to extremes. A rigorous fitness plan and severe caloric restriction. Because that was how life worked. Sarah learned from a very young age that if you wanted something good in your life, well, you were going to have to suffer for it first. Sarah learned that early on, around 12 years old, when her mother left her father and ran off to Argentina with another man. At the time, her mother said she was sorry, of course, but she put up with Sarah's father and his adultery for years, and now it was her turn. Sarah's mother deserved to be happy, but unfortunately, that would mean she would need to leave her 2 daughters behind. She didn't want to disrupt the lives of her near-teenage daughters. That's 12-year-old Sarah and her slightly older sister, Jane. Sarah lied and told her mother she was happy for her. To go on, don't worry about her. But in truth, she was gutted. A few years later, her sister would move away, and Sarah was painfully lonely. Of course, you didn't see it on the outside. She was always bubbly, quick to smile. But inside, she was hollow. A hollowness that she tried to fill whatever way she could. With comfort, with flavor, with pleasure. And now, at the age of 26, it was Sarah's turn. After years of rudderless relationships, one-sided obsessions, and a complicated connection with her father, it was Sarah's turn. When she was married, she wouldn't need to worry about her weight, because Sarah only ate when she was lonely. But as of that day, July 23rd, 1986, Sarah knew she wouldn't be lonely anymore. Here in the vast expanse of Westminster Abbey were 2,000 people. A mix of family, royalty, notable luminaries, and celebrities of that era. From Nancy Reagan to Joan Rivers to Elton John. All of them gazing at her. Fergie, the center of attention, her eyes gleaming behind the bridal veil. And with one step, then another down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, she could see her future husband, Prince Andrew, who was at that time seen as quite a catch. But Fergie was the one. And he even designed the ring he slid on her finger. The engagement ring featured a gleaming ruby, known as a Burma ruby, known for its blood-red color. And the prince said it reminded him of Sarah's glorious red hair. Sarah said yes, of course. Just a few months older than Andrew, 26-year-old Sarah had finally found true love. She'd suffered long enough. This was Sarah's turn. and the world was on her side. Even the impossible-to-please British media praised her as a breath of fresh air, lovely, witty, and welcome. After a string of dating only models and actresses, Prince Andrew discovered Fergie was a surprising but sensible choice. Randy Andy finally ready to settle down. And with Andy came a whole family, a dynasty that dated back 1,000 years, a dynasty she was a part of. Like Princess Diana, Sarah too had aristocratic ties. She'd grown up around the royals and could claim a tiny branch somewhere in the vast family tree. First established back in the 1600s, a bloodline linked Sarah's family all the way back to King Charles II. Though Sarah's father, Ronald Ferguson, was by no means rich and by no means a royal. His expertise was horses, on the polo field and on the racetrack. But Sarah was deemed genetically worthy enough for Queen Elizabeth to approve of the marriage between Sarah and Andrew, the Queen's favorite son. Born in 1959, 12 years after his brother Charles, Andrew was doted upon by the Queen in a way his older siblings, that's Charles and Anne, were not, which made Andrew, from the very beginning, a special child, even if he would never be king. By 1986, Prince William, who was heir to the throne after Prince Charles, he was already born. He was 4 years old. This meant Prince Andrew had the freedom to pursue the career he wanted, which was a career in the military, as a lieutenant in the Navy. And he had the freedom to choose his bride, Sarah Ferguson. And that day, she and her husband were anointed the Duke and Duchess of York. And after the ceremony, as the two stood on a balcony in Buckingham Palace, the crowd of thousands of people cheered them on for their first kiss as husband and wife. It was a glorious moment, and it was just a moment. After the ceremony, there was a celebratory lunch. It followed the traditional royal protocol. It was a subdued affair. The 300 or so people there, they all raised their glasses, but there was no toast to the bride and groom, no speeches. There was cold lobster, chilled champagne, and a giant 240-pound wedding cake that Andrew cut with a ceremonial sword. And as he sliced into that cake, it was Sarah who felt a little stab of regret. A part of her wanted to be a regular bride, for a best man to get up and make a funny speech, for her best friend, a maid of honor, who could tell funny stories about what she was like when she was little. But there was nothing like that. She knew very few people there, and very few people knew her. But this, she accepted, was what she signed up for. She wasn't even Sarah Ferguson anymore. As of that day, Queen Elizabeth II anointed them the Duke and Duchess of York. And with this new name came a whole new life, and what she thought was a whole new beginning. Not the beginning of the end. Never complain, never explain. That was the motto of the British royal family back in the 1980s, as it had been since back in the 1880s, when then Queen Victoria embraced that philosophy. Never complain. Well, nobody had to worry about Sarah Ferguson. What did she have to complain about? When she rolled up to Buckingham Palace with her battered suitcases, she felt like a modern-day Jane Eyre. Nothing but gratitude. A humble little girl from nowhere, now officially an HRH, Her Royal Highness, Sarah, Duchess of York. Her mother-in-law, that's Queen Elizabeth II, had gifted her and her new husband, Prince Andrew, a parcel of land in the countryside near Windsor Castle, where the Duke and Duchess of York would soon start construction on their dream home, a process that would take a long time. So the couple would, for the moment, remain ensconced in the Buckingham Palace bachelor pad of the former Randy Andy. Over the years, the handsome prince with the toothy grin had entertained many a lucky lady. But for now, these quarters were their home. Never complain. Fair enough. Never explain. Now that would prove trickier, because things might have turned out differently if someone had sat Sarah down and explained the way things were going to be, starting with her less than warm welcome. Why was it, when she showed up with her things, she had to stow them in a hallway cupboard in Buckingham Palace because no one, it seemed, had thought to make room for her in her husband's bedroom, which was, by the way, a shabby boy's room, not meant for a married couple. And sure, it was Buckingham Palace, but one could argue it felt basically like the royal equivalent of living in your mother-in-law's basement. And no one appeared to explain to Sarah her husband Andrew's busy schedule. When the pair began dating at the end of 1985, after essentially being set up by Princess Diana at a dinner party, Andrew was smitten. He took Sarah to the ballet, sent her flowers, drove long distances to see her on a moment's notice. Now, less than a year later, Andrew was off once again. Not long after their honeymoon, Andrew was stationed 150 miles away from London for his duty as a naval lieutenant. Home sporadically on weekends, and when he did come home, Sarah noticed he appeared agitated and grumpy. Caught between his dual responsibilities, and Andrew, he wasn't much for responsibility. Despite all the time spent away as a naval officer, he did the bare minimum of work, and he was afforded a rank and position he arguably did not earn. Of course, he would say he wanted to be treated like everybody else, but that was impossible. His entire life, he'd been propped up as His Royal Highness, any shortcomings and failures obscured by an entire system built to ensure his success. No matter how hard Andrew didn't try, he'd succeed. As a child, his mother saw him as a spirited imp. He was never disciplined, never told no, and if someone did try and teach him a lesson, like maybe not play pranks on the staff, not to bully other children, not to hurt others, well, he might run and complain to Mummy, and that person might find themselves without a job. Even his own siblings, especially his elder brother Prince Charles, could barely tolerate him. And a resentment festered between the two brothers for years, the heir and his spare. Though when his younger brother Edward was born a few years later, Andrew still acted like the baby, throwing temper tantrums and yelling until he got what he wanted. Nobody was allowed to touch him. No one allowed to cross him. He was a royal. But like Sarah, Andrew, too, was deeply lonely. And something that made them compatible was how they created all kinds of distractions, raucous partying, reckless behavior, obnoxious laughter, so they'd never have to feel the crushing, desperate silence of being alone with their own thoughts. And now here in Buckingham Palace, just days after her return from their honeymoon, Sarah was alone. And so she did whatever she could to try and keep Andrew's attention and ensure his affection. She wrote him letter after letter, sending them to his naval base, telling him how much she missed him, but he never wrote back. Hoping to find a way to connect with him through his own interests, Sarah herself learned how to fly a plane, earning her pilot's license in 1987. Sarah was the first female royal in history to do so. But this skill, it flouted traditional royal protocol and ultimately failed to impress her husband. But for Fergie, she found it thrilling, and it offered an escape from the mounting pressure and scrutiny happening thousands of feet below. In 1987, Sarah said Andrew was only home 40 days of that entire year. Sarah was herself disappointed. The man who won her over with his movie star looks and adventurous spirit proved to be a couch potato. He preferred to stay home and play video games, watch movies, and later porn by himself. And Sarah, isolated and alone, would sit and cry by herself, wondering what had gone wrong and how she could fix it. She didn't know, not yet. That was just the way Andy was. He was arrogant and sneaky, sleeping with at least 12 women within their first year of marriage. When she couldn't fix her marriage, she tried to fix her body. This was the 1980s, where one could never be too rich or too thin. But Fergie, who was admired by her school friends by her athletic achievements back in high school, was ruthlessly ridiculed by the tabloids. The very same British press who lauded Sarah Ferguson for radiating character would soon be describing her in more vicious terms, at one point referring to Fergie as the Duchess of Pork. She was fighting a miserable, unwinnable battle, exercising with a special trainer flown in from New York, sometimes working out 3 hours a day, then crash dieting, where she ate only tropical fruit and drank hot water with ginger. And within that first year of marriage, Sarah was fed up. And much like her mother, she decided it was her turn. She was going to do what she wanted. Her husband had no discipline or boundaries. Neither did Sarah. So why hold herself back? Why try and control her reckless impulses if her husband didn't? And in less than a year, those who knew her before would say they didn't recognize this new imperious persona, Her Royal Highness. Once Fergie and Andrew moved into their own sizable estate, Sarah had anywhere from 12 to 20 people waiting on her hand and foot. And Sarah, apparently bored and angry, found new ways to be a royal pain in the ass. Anyone who was of lower status, even if they did not work directly for Sarah, they were expected to curtsy and refer to her not as ma'am, but as Your Royal Highness. And the tyranny started from the very first moment she woke up until she went to bed. For breakfast, she demanded freshly squeezed orange juice, and when she said freshly squeezed, she meant freshly squeezed. Oranges sliced in front of her at the breakfast table as she sat down, hand-pressed into an empty glass. For lunch, she would ask them to make 10 different types of pasta because she couldn't decide, then end up eating a bag of potato chips. When she came home late with a bunch of friends, she demanded they make a 7-course meal at midnight. She developed an intolerance for clothes that didn't smell right. And if they didn't have a specific scent, she would order everything to be washed again. She insisted that 2 hot water bottles be placed on her side of the king-size bed each night, and ordered her staff to measure the temperature of the water so it was exactly to her liking. Though to be fair to Fergie, once you're a royal, you can't really do anything by yourself. So your specific preferences, they have to be communicated. And those communications can be easily misinterpreted and misconstrued by a resentful staff, those who didn't respect her or her position. This included a group she called the Gray Men, courtiers, members of staff who she was convinced wanted her to fail. And the only person who could remotely understand what she was going through was Princess Diana. And while her own marriage was in shambles, who also struggled with disordered eating, and who always seemed on the wrong side of the Queen. And it was Diana who would come to Fergie for advice on how to be more assertive. Besides, by the late 1980s, Princess Diana, she'd found a way to cope by taking refuge in her two young sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. Though over time, rumors abound that it would be Princess Diana who would betray Fergie, a way to get the spotlight off of herself, throwing Fergie to the wolves. Both Fergie and Andrew were flagrantly unfaithful, but whatever Fergie did made news. It was almost as if the photographers knew where Fergie would be before she even got there. Never complain, never explain might have been the official royal rule. There was another unspoken edict no one ever talked about. Something along the lines of, if you can't speak, you can always leak. There was a whole tabloid ecosystem that thrived off of any tidbits they could get about the royals. And she was the gift that kept on giving. When she wasn't being criticized about her weight, she was being maligned for her voracious appetite in spending. Why buy one cashmere sweater for 650 pounds when you can buy 20? Why ride an old Mercedes when you can get a brand new Jaguar? Why keep those old battered suitcases when you can just as easily fly to New York City on someone's private jet and come back with 51 new pieces of luggage, all of them stuffed with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of clothing, gifts. That is, if she paid the bills at all. Sarah had a tendency to avoid things she didn't want to think about. And the way that she got away from them was by physically going somewhere else. There's one famous story of Fergie being in France, staying in a multi-million-dollar villa, when she learned the electricity might be cut off in her own home because nobody had paid the bill. And still, no matter how much money she spent, especially on clothes, it was never the right thing. In 1988, she ranked number 1 on fashion commentator Richard Blackwell's worst dressed list, brutally described as a fashion obscenity who walked like a duck with a bad leg. And she looked more like she was making beds in Ireland or milking cows than a member of the royal court. With such contempt aimed at her in her home country, it's no wonder why Fergie wanted to be out of town as much as possible. And she soon discovered she and Prince Andrew could go anywhere they wanted, all over the world, for free. Their presence, a royal endorsement. Andrew and Fergie never turned down anything that was free, because this was the fundamental secret, the biggest lie in their relationship. Despite what people might have thought, Fergie and Andrew didn't have any money. Sarah might have assumed that as a member of the monarch, she'd be rich. But it turned out the Duke and Duchess barely had a ducat between them. This might come as a surprise to those of us on the outside, But Sarah and Andrew were struggling financially at the time of their marriage. Andrew made a modest salary as a naval officer. Sarah, who initially worked for a publishing company, brought in even less. Any additional money they earned was like a royal allowance. Special funds set aside for them to live off of, like a stipend that was seen as a payment for their royal duties. But with that money, they had to pay for their own staff and general upkeep. With a base salary tied to being essentially brand ambassadors for the UK, you were not allowed to have an opinion. By law, they were not even allowed to be involved in politics, and it was imperative anyone in the monarch stayed politically neutral. It's an institution, one that you belonged to and worked for. And while there is security in this position, there is no autonomy. Your time, your money, your identity, it's no longer your own. As a royal, you essentially belong to the people. And the people, they have strong and conflicting feelings on what that means. British taxes aren't used to pay for the royals' salaries. But taxes are used to pay for royals' security. And when anyone in the royal family goes anywhere, they need security, which can get pretty expensive. Each member of the royal family has their own dedicated team, and in some instances, a trip outside of the UK can cost millions of pounds. And because it's coming from British taxes, British citizens and, of course, the media, they pay attention to where the royals go and how they get there. Now, the public, they seem okay when they're spending their tax money on royals traveling as part of their public service. But when taxpayer money goes to security for private travel, there's extra scrutiny. And oftentimes these trips for pleasure seem indulgent and inappropriate. But soon after the Duke and Duchess of York were married, Fergie, lonely and restless, appeared to take advantage of every opportunity. She couldn't resist a freebie, despite the cost of security. Now, for the average Brit, a vacation might be a week in Cornwall. Fergie and Andrew, they jetted off to faraway islands. Fergie often traveled alone or with her friends, going to Swiss ski resorts, beaches in the south of France, but the press tracking her every move. Even after she had 2 children, Fergie was depicted as a selfish absentee mother. On one of her trips, she took off with Andrew when her first daughter was only 6 weeks old. The optics on this were not good, especially when compared to Princess Diana, or as Fergie liked to call her, Little Miss Perfect and Goody Two-Shoes. Princess Diana was Fergie's 4th cousin. They knew each other almost their whole lives. Now in the royal family, they were constantly being compared, and Fergie almost always came up short. Diana never went anywhere without her children, and she rarely took a vacation by herself. She did hundreds of charitable events each year. In one year, Diana performed over 400 charity events. Meanwhile, Her Royal Highness, Sarah, Duchess of York, the very same year, she performed less than 50. Fergie soon earned another nickname, Her Royal Excess. So somewhere along the way, Sarah needed to improve her image and also afford her travel opportunities. So it was in Fergie's best interest to find a way to be more charitable, and this is where the trouble began. Now, Fergie wouldn't see it this way. She saw herself as someone who was abundantly generous. But it just so happened her sense of charity always seemed to come with a bit of self-interest. As a royal, she was supposed to keep her non-profit and for-profit enterprises separate. Fergie appeared to blur those lines to her own advantage from the start. On one trip to Africa, Fergie was invited to visit sick children in Kenya. This trip was paid for by a charity to generate interest and attention to that cause, which she did, but not in the way that they might have hoped for. Did she visit sick children? Yes. But she also took the time to go on a fabulous safari, go to the beach, stay in a luxurious hotel that cost in 1 week what an average Kenyan would make in a year. And she seemed completely oblivious to these indulgences. In other cases, the money she managed to raise for the charity was sometimes offset by the wildly expensive costs for her to travel. Everything had to be first class: private jets, a full staff, 5-star hotels. And when the press called this out, she would often make a big gesture, try and smooth it over by saying she was donating tens of thousands of dollars to a charity. But there is evidence these promises were rarely kept. In the 1990s, Sarah struck a deal with a publisher to write a series of children's books. And with that, she announced her plans to donate all of the proceeds to charity. Then, when the books were published, and it appeared she might make millions off of TV and merchandising rights, she reduced that amount to 10%. Then, later, reporters discovered that in the end, she kept all of that money, estimated to be over $2 million, for herself. Eventually, Sarah realized that traveling for other charities wasn't getting her the results that she wanted. So she decided to dabble in creating her own nonprofits, foundations that focused on children in need. There was even one dedicated to teenage girls in crisis. But running a nonprofit is difficult and time-consuming, and her various efforts were poorly organized and ultimately didn't lead to any sizable, measurable impact. But saying she had a foundation, well, it kept her on the world stage, and it allowed her to call herself a humanitarian, a philanthropist, an advocate, especially for young women and girls. That is, unless, of course, those girls in crisis were victims of Jeffrey Epstein. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Back in the late 1980s, the Duke and Duchess needed money, and the Queen was done with handouts, and she frowned upon their lavish lifestyle while the other royals seemed to live modestly. In practical matters like balancing a budget, paying bills, what we would call adulting, Sarah and Andrew, they were clueless. They knew how to ski, ride horses, fly planes, but as individuals, they had no real skills. These were not serious people, and yet time and time again, they were being placed in serious situations as thought leaders, in circumstances in which they had no relevance or place. The fact was, despite their elevated status, neither Sarah nor Andrew were well educated. Andrew was a terrible student and chose the military over university. And even in the military, he was never promoted because he wasn't considered skilled enough. Sarah, after attending a girls' boarding school, briefly attended a secretarial college to learn typing and office skills, and she struggled desperately to keep up. But this is not unusual. The royals as a whole aren't traditionally well educated. For centuries, royal children were homeschooled, taught by tutors. In fact, Prince Charles was the first ever royal to graduate from university. He attended Cambridge. Diana, she was essentially a high school dropout, leaving school at 16, and would later find her lack of education made her even more self-conscious and insecure than she already was. Subsequent generations fared slightly better. Prince William, who was destined to be king, he attended university, as did Andrew and Sarah's future children, Eugenie and Beatrice. Prince Harry, like Andrew, graduated essentially from high school, then went into the military. Perhaps surprisingly, the only former member of the royal family who actually studied international affairs in college, was Harry's wife, Meghan Markle, or rather, the Duchess of Sussex, who, just like Fergie, enjoys a conditional courtesy title of Duchess, which doesn't mean that anyone isn't intelligent. But frankly, they are granted a power and authority and trust that is disproportionate to their training or experience. The bottom line was, Fergie and Andrew needed to make a lot of money fast. Their titles were their greatest value. Everything they did hinged on being HRH, His and Her Royal Highness. And they soon discovered how to leverage their titles to enjoy the lifestyle they felt entitled to have without actually having to do anything. They would discover people would just give them things. From the very beginning, they relied on the generosity of what you might call benefactors, the truly wealthy, not royals, but titans of industry, individuals with plenty of money, but no status. And so they turned to the Duke and Duchess to help them gain that status. And the Duke and Duchess weren't particularly discriminating. There are too many to count, but the most notable were a fair number of American multimillionaires and billionaires who would come to their rescue. There was one American millionaire who once handed Sarah a bag of $40,000 in cash, with the apparent unspoken understanding that one day, if he needed something, Sarah would be expected to help him out. But their most notable patron was a certain New York financier named Jeffrey Epstein. Now, there are a few different versions of this origin story, but it appears that it was actually Sarah who knew Ghislaine Maxwell first, and it was Sarah who introduced Prince Andrew to Ghislaine Maxwell. And Ghislaine Maxwell and Prince Andrew would actually go on to have a romantic relationship off and on for many years. And Ghislaine Maxwell introduced Prince Andrew to Jeffrey Epstein. And from the very beginning, from the 90s when they were first getting to know each other, it was never a friendship. Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell targeted Prince Andrew, knowing they could likely manipulate him to get access to the people they really cared about, the contacts that Prince Andrew had through the royal family. Which is why, behind his back, Epstein didn't refer to Prince Andrew as a friend, but as his Super Bowl trophy. And by extension, Sarah was the trophy's wife. And while years later, they would claim they barely knew him, the Duchess of York and her 2 daughters would stay with Jeffrey Epstein at his apartment in New York City in the 1990s. And at that time, it was a friendship of convenience. They all ran in the same circles. Only later would it become a relationship based on need and greed. It was 1996, when the scandals around Sarah and her affairs were becoming so public and so embarrassing. Queen Elizabeth herself demanded that Prince Andrew divorce Sarah for good. And while devastating at the time, it would prove to be the best thing that ever happened to Sarah, because she could keep the courtesy title of being the Duchess of York, all the royal, without the hassle. And she would soon parlay that title into her own company, literally called Duchess Inc. And in the late 1990s, there was a reversal of fortune. Suddenly it was Sarah who was on top and Andrew on the bottom. Andrew in the UK, Sarah in the US. Andrew sinking into deep depression. He apparently still loved Sarah deeply and wanted her back. Until then, Andrew was in full midlife crisis mode, trying to dress like he was in his 20s and date as many young women as he could. Sarah was by then referring to him as lard face and wanted nothing to do with Prince Andrew. And why would she? In 1997, she scored a lucrative contract with Weight Watchers, along with other projects, possible talk shows, a series of books that she published, even though they were ghostwritten, and she was filled with big ideas of how she was going to make it in show business. Because the only thing better than being royally famous was being Hollywood famous. And this is where you want to take Sarah by the shoulders and shake her. Because she had a lot of money. And at one point, a financial advisor stepped forward and offered to help her manage her money. But instead, Sarah sought financial advice from one of her many psychics, a clairvoyant, who assured Sarah no matter how much money she spent or how much money she lost, there was always fortune around the corner. Uncannily, this was true. There was always someone somewhere willing to give her an opportunity. But eventually, once again, her overspending did her in. And her reputation for being difficult to work with, it meant the offers thinned out and the money dried up. And she would find herself broke and deeply in debt. Not only did her finances affect her this time, she left a lot of people unpaid, from everyday folks like dry cleaners to assistants, and a lot of people who relied on her were left high and dry by her misspending. There were lawsuits pending, and she was in a lot of trouble. And when she refused to pay them, swearing she didn't have any money, nearly everyone that she was close to, from her business partners to her former assistant to her past paramours, even her own father, and also even one of her psychics, they decided to cash in by penning tell-alls about what Sarah was really like, selling their stories to newspapers, publishing books, telling her tales in graphic, humiliating detail. At a certain point, it was clear everyone else was making money off of Sarah, more than Sarah was earning for herself. By the mid-2000s, she had no choice but to reconnect with Prince Andrew, and he was happy to have her back. And they decided that they would smooth things over. And while there were rumors they might remarry, that didn't happen. Because, at least for Sarah, this wasn't a love match. This was more like a relationship of mutual financial benefit. And, if things went south, mutually assured destruction. Now, what Andrew knew about what Sarah did next, it's unclear. But around 2010, there were rumors that Sarah was running something of a royal scam, where Sarah would get wind of a wealthy investor, typically from another country, maybe say a person who didn't have much traction with the UK government, and she would find a way to arrange a meeting. And in this meeting, she would offer access to her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, for a price. Which might have been fine, except Prince Andrew, he now had an unpaid role with the British government. Now, it was a vanity position. He didn't have a huge amount of power, but he did have a role as a senior royal in facilitating business partnerships and trade agreements with foreign countries. Which means Sarah wasn't exactly selling a meet and greet with Prince Andrew. She was essentially initiating an opportunity for a bribe. Sarah said that if a business deal moved forward, then Sarah would get a percentage of the profits from that business arrangement. An arrangement she described as getting a lick of the spoon. Now, it's not clear how often this worked, how much money she made, but there are clear rules about royals not being allowed to leverage their title and their status for their own personal gain. At that time, of course, it was just a rumor. Nobody had clear evidence this was what Sarah was up to. And it would have stayed a rumor had Sarah not sat down with the wrong guy. On May 13th, 2010, Sarah had a meeting in a New York hotel with someone she thought was a prominent businessman looking for an opportunity in the UK. and she explained to him what this arrangement might look like. That she could arrange a meeting with Prince Andrew if this businessman agreed to wire £500,000, that's about $650,000, into her bank account. And if he didn't want to commit to that right now, well, she would take $40,000 cash. And it turned out that person wasn't a businessman, but a reporter for a newspaper. And this whole dirty encounter was caught on tape. And soon it found its way to the front page of a newspaper and spread all over the internet and all over the world. And Sarah was busted. This was no doubt her biggest scandal yet. Though the encounter did manage to inspire her to write yet another memoir. And shockingly, in this memoir, she depicts herself as the victim, that she was targeted by an unscrupulous journalist, and all she was trying to do was raise money for a girls' school in Afghanistan. Now, Andrew would say he had no idea Sarah was doing this. But whatever the case, whether Andrew knew about it or not, with so many scandals and Sarah's finances so desperate, they'd exhausted their goodwill pretty much everywhere else, except with one person. They turned to the one person who would help them. No judgment. Jeffrey Epstein. Now, the exact duration and the exact amount Epstein gave Sarah Ferguson, some say it's $15,000. Others suggest that it's closer to hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's money given over the course of 15 years, including 2011. This was already after Jeffrey Epstein had gone to prison. And according to Andrew Lowney, all while they were denouncing him and pretending they barely knew him, they were accepting money from Jeffrey Epstein. Money that Sarah would likely say was supposed to go to help young girls in crisis. What's more, she didn't just stay silent about what her ex-husband did to these victims. She went out of her way to try and discredit their stories. This included Virginia Roberts Giuffre. When Virginia came forward once again and tried to tell her story, Sarah apparently called journalists that she knew in an effort to try and get the journalists to go after Virginia and discredit her. On top of that, when that famous picture of Virginia and Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell went public, Sarah sided with her ex-husband, saying that she believed that picture was faked. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, there was correspondence suggesting that Sarah was very concerned about her ex-husband's relationship with Epstein. Now that all of this is coming to the surface, what Sarah will say and do next, who knows? As of now, they appear to have lost everything, including those very important titles. And I'm not sure what they're going to call themselves next. But I'm sure we can all think of a few choice names. Thank you so much for listening. And believe me when I say I have only scratched the surface. If you want the full, most accurate, well-told version of these events, please, I implore you to read Andrew Lowney's book, entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, which, as always, I will link to in the show notes. I'll be back next week with an all-new episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. Until next time, nighty-night.